All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something that's, well, always been kind of relevant.
Always a good one.
Right. How do intellectuals shape the world around us? And we've got some excerpts to help us unpack all this
Oh, yeah.
from Thomas Sowell's Intellectuals in Society. I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with that one.
Yeah, classic.
And Richard Wolin's The Seduction of Unreason.
Two books that really get you thinking.
Yeah, they don't hold back.
No, they don't.
So before we get into the specifics, I've got to ask you something that Sowell kind of throws out there right at the beginning.
Okay, shoot.
So let's say, hypothetically, I'm a plumber,
Right.
but in my spare time, I, geek out on philosophy. Big time. Would Sowell consider me an intellectual?
See, that's where Sowell makes a pretty interesting distinction, right? He's not talking about people who just think deeply.
Which we all do. I mean, come on.
Of course, yeah, everyone thinks. He's really focused on people whose actual job is to deal in ideas. So academics, writers, that kind of crowd.
So it's more about, their profession.
It is. And there's another key point. He says their work is mainly judged by other intellectuals.
Interesting.
Not necessarily by whether those ideas actually, work out in the real world.
So there's potentially a disconnect there.
Yeah, for sure.
It's almost like, are they in a bubble?
You could say that. An echo chamber, maybe? And that leads to some big questions, right? Does this insider validation, this kind of closed loop, does it affect the kinds of ideas that become popular among intellectuals?
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So maybe that plumber philosopher, the one I was just talking about,
Yeah.
maybe he's not an intellectual in Sowell's book,
Yeah.
but he's definitely got something to think about there.
He does.
Okay, so one concept that really jumped out at me, and I feel like this happens to a lot of people,
Oh, yeah.
was Sowell's idea of the vision of the anointed.
Right.
And this is where it gets personal. I remember one time I was working on this community project, totally grassroots, trying to address some real needs in my neighborhood.
Awesome. Sounds great.
But I was talking to this professor I knew, and he basically told me it was, well-intentioned but naive.
Oh, wow.
He kind of just dismissed the whole thing because it didn't fit his idea of how things should be done.
I can see why that would be frustrating.
It was. What?
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing Sowell's getting at with this vision of the anointed, right? His argument is that a lot of intellectuals, they see themselves as this kind of vanguard with superior knowledge, superior morality.
Okay, so they know better than everyone else.
That's the attitude. And it leads to this we know best sort of approach where they feel totally justified in imposing their solutions, even if those solutions don't really work for the people they're supposedly helping.
It's giving me some serious ivory tower vibes here.
Oh, yeah, big time. And what's fascinating is how this connects to these historical patterns that Wolin digs into in his book.
Okay, tell me more.
He explores this whole counter-enlightenment movement, right?
Yeah.
And you see these ideas, elite control, suspicion of democracy, skepticism of individual reason. They've been around for centuries.
So it's history's on repeat, but with, different remixes.
Yeah, exactly. Different beats, but the same kind of melody.
Okay, so let's say these intellectuals, with their anointed vision, they actually get involved in shaping society. What actually happens? Does it always go as planned?
Well, that's where Sowell and Wolin both get real. They give us some, I'd say some pretty sobering cautionary tales.
Lay on me.
We see all these examples of intellectuals championing ideas that sound great, on paper.
Yeah.
But then when they're actually put into practice, disaster.
And Sowell's not afraid to get specific. But the example that really stuck with me was the whole anti-DDT campaign.
Oh, yeah. That's a tough one.
It was largely driven by intellectuals who were, rightfully worried about the environmental impact.
Right. Valid concerns.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what happened? Malaria came roaring back in parts of the world where it had almost been eradicated.
It's a tragedy. Millions of lives lost because of that.
Yeah.
And it highlights something really important. We got to consider the full spectrum of outcomes, not just the ones that fit a certain ideology or agenda.
Speaking of ideology, I got to ask about Wolin's whole discussion of left fascism.
Oh, yeah, that one always throws people off.
Because on the surface, it just sounds like a contradiction.
Right. But he looks at figures like Georges Bataille, this French intellectual, and the Contre-Attaque group, who actually, believe it or not, advocated for violence and dictatorship.
Whoa.
The idea was that these were necessary evils to achieve some supposedly noble end. It's chilling. It shows how even brilliant minds can get blinded by ideology.
And lose sight of basic human values.
Totally.
It's a stark reminder that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. It makes me wonder, should intellectuals be held accountable for these unintended consequences?
Ooh, that's a big one.
Especially when their ideas have such a huge impact on policy and how the public thinks.
Right. And it gets even trickier when you factor in how the media and the whole intellectual establishment shape the narrative around certain people.
Which brings me to Sowell's discussion of Justice Clarence Thomas.
Yeah.
It's like a textbook example of how someone's intellect and what they actually achieve can get totally twisted.
It's fascinating, right? So Sowell points out how Thomas's work ethic and his actual influence on the Supreme Court, it's often distorted by this narrative that basically paints him as, like, Scalia's puppet.
Yeah, it's like they're saying he doesn't have his own thoughts.
Exactly, the lacking independent thought thing. But then Sowell brings in this evidence from Justice Blackmun's private notes.
Oh, wow.
And it suggests a totally different dynamic was going on behind the scenes. Apparently, Thomas was often taking the lead in shaping arguments, challenging his colleagues' thinking.
So it's like the image they create of him doesn't match the reality at all.
Nope. And that makes you wonder, right? Is this tendency to dismiss outsiders, even if they accomplish incredible things, is that a common pattern among intellectuals? Do they value conformity of thought more than, like, actual achievement or diversity of ideas?
I mean, it's something to think about, especially when you look at how certain narratives about race and social justice are so dominant in intellectual circles.
And that's where Sowell's whole analysis of what he calls cosmic justice gets really interesting.
Okay, break that down for me.
He's challenging this idea that, like, every problem faced by Black Americans today can be traced back to slavery.
And he uses some statistics that really make you question that narrative.
Oh, yeah.
Like he points out that as recently as 1960, 2/3 of Black children were living in two-parent families.
Which challenges this whole assumption that single-parent households are, like, solely a product of slavery.
Right. And he mentions that a century ago, Black marriage rates were actually higher than those of whites.
Wild, right?
Yeah, and that Black employment rates in certain periods were higher than white employment rates. So it's like, wait a minute, what's going on here?
It's not about denying the horrors of slavery or its impact, but Sowell's pushing for a more nuanced understanding of cause and effect, especially when it comes to these complex social issues. If we reduce everything to a single cause, we're going to oversimplify things.
And end up with bad policies.
Potentially, yeah.
It's like he's saying, look at the whole picture, not just the parts that fit a convenient story.
Exactly. And this kind of brings us to another theme that runs through both of these books.
I'm intrigued. What is it?
It's the power of language to shape narratives and control debates.
Oh, yeah. So Sowell goes off about this. He hates tactics like shifting the burden of proof or using vague terms or emotionally charged language to basically shut down any critical thinking.
I mean, we see that all the time, right?
All the time. And he specifically calls out phrases like glass ceiling and disparate impact.
It's like the words themselves become weapons.
Yeah. And Wolin kind of connects this to the rise of postmodernism and deconstruction, where the focus shifts to interpretation and language games instead of actually engaging with, objective reality.
Right. Right.
It's a slippery slope. If language becomes the main battleground, are we even talking about the same issues anymore? Like, are we missing the real problems we need to be addressing?
It's a deep question.
Right. It's like we're in this hall of mirrors where everything's up for grabs.
Totally. And that makes it even more important to sharpen those critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
We got to be able to see through the smoke and mirrors to figure out what's actually being said and what's being left unsaid.
We need a BS detector for ideas.
Exactly. And luckily, Sowell and Wolin give us some tools to build one.
One thing that really struck me about Sowell's book is how he kind of highlights this disconnect between intellectuals and, like, the real world.
Oh, tell me more.
It's about wealth creation,
Yes.
right? How things actually get made, how businesses work, all that practical stuff.
Yeah, okay.
It's as if there's this blind spot when it comes to understanding those processes.
Like they're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it can lead to some pretty wild conclusions. So Wall gives this great example about the criticisms of Standard Oil back in the day. Oh, yeah, the evil monopoly.
That's the one. And one of the big accusations was that they were getting preferential treatment from the railroads, like lower shipping costs than their competitors.
Which, yeah, on the surface sounds totally unfair.
Right, rigging the system. But Sowell digs deeper and finds this crucial detail that everyone was kind of ignoring.
What was this?
Standard Oil was shipping their oil in tank cars, which were way more efficient than the barrels everyone else was using.
Oh, so they were actually saving the railroads money by streamlining the whole process.
Exactly. So it makes sense they'd get a discount. It's the classic example of assuming bad intentions when there's a perfectly logical explanation.
Makes sense.
Right. And this tendency to overlook the practical realities of business, it pops up again and again.
It reminds me of how people react to, like, high interest rates on loans in lower income neighborhoods.
Yeah, yeah.
There's this immediate assumption of predatory lending exploitation.
Right. But Sowell's like, hold on, consider the costs and risks involved in lending to those communities. Higher default rates, the need for more intensive loan management, all that.
So it's more complicated than just greedy lenders.
Way more. So Sowell emphasizes how crucial incentives and constraints are when you're analyzing economic situations.
Got it.
He says they're key to understanding how markets actually work. And if you ignore them, you end up with policies that sound good, but don't work in practice.
Okay, so let's talk about a policy that had a huge impact. The New Deal. I know Sowell's got some pretty controversial takes on that whole era.
Oh yeah, he goes there. He argues that the stock market crash in '29, while obviously a huge deal, wasn't the sole cause of the Depression.
Go.
He points out that the corporate sector overall was losing money for 2 years straight before that, which points to some deeper issues in the economy.
But it wasn't just a sudden shock, but a longer-term thing.
Exactly. And this is where it gets spacey. Sowell suggests that the New Deal, with all its good intentions about relief and stimulating the economy, might have actually prolonged the Depression.
Wow, really?
By interfering with natural market forces.
That's a bold claim.
It is. But his point is that government intervention, even when it's trying to do good, can backfire sometimes. We got to recognize how complex economic systems are.
We can't just, control them even if we want to.
Right. It's a reminder that tough problems rarely have easy solutions. And speaking of complex systems, Sowell's stuff on modern education is really something.
Yeah, I was struck by his critique of those values clarification programs.
Yeah. He sees those as an attempt to basically reshape how kids think, often without their parents even knowing about it.
It's almost like social engineering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Sowell argues that this can create a huge rift between families and schools. Like, you've got schools undermining the values that parents are trying to instill at home.
It's a trust issue, right? Can we always trust intellectuals to have the best interests of society in mind?
It's a tough question. Or are they, like Sowell says, sometimes more focused on their own vision of how things should be, even if it clashes with how people actually live their lives?
It's like they're out of touch.
In a way, yeah. And both Sowell and Wolin bring this up in their discussions of crime, which is interesting how their views kind of come together there.
Oh, how so?
So Paula points out that intellectuals tend to favor these abstract theories of crime, focusing on poverty or social injustice as the root causes.
While dismissing things like tougher law enforcement.
Right. More cops on the streets, stricter sentencing, all that. It's like they're prioritizing ideology over what actually works.
And Sowell brings the receipts, right?
Oh, yeah. He cites studies showing how increased police presence in high crime areas leads to big drops in crime.
Which, makes sense. If it's harder to commit a crime and you're more likely to get caught, crime goes down.
Makes sense to me. But Sowell's point is that these common sense approaches are often dismissed as too simplistic or even insensitive.
It's like they don't address the root causes, so they're not valid.
Exactly. But if they actually work, shouldn't we at least consider them?
Yeah, if they make communities safer.
Right. And then Wolin adds another layer to this. He examines how intellectuals, especially in Europe, have often romanticized crime and criminals.
Interesting. Like they're rebels or something.
Yeah, seeing them as fighting against this stifling bourgeois society. And Wolin argues that this romantic vision can downplay the real harm that crime does.
So it's a disconnect from the actual victims of crime.
Totally. And it raises the question of whose voices are being heard and whose are being silenced in these discussions. Intellectuals don't have all the answers.
No one does.
We should be seeking out diverse perspectives, especially from people who've actually experienced these issues firsthand.
We can't let the theories overshadow the reality.
Exactly. So how do we make sense of all this? How do intellectuals actually influence society?
It's complicated.
It is. So Walla argues it's not always about direct control or pushing specific policies. It's more subtle, like shaping public opinion, how we frame debates, even the language we use.
They're setting the stage for how we think about the world.
Yeah, and one of the most, kind of scary examples he gives is how intellectuals in the lead up to World War II downplayed the threat of Hitler and the Nazis.
Wow, seriously?
It wasn't just a few fringe folks either. He cites mainstream newspapers and publications showing how this whole appeasement mindset was pretty widespread among intellectuals at the time.
It's like a cautionary tale about groupthink, right?
Big time. And this tendency to dismiss opposing views or oversimplify complex situations, it didn't end with World War II.
It does feel kind of familiar, doesn't it?
Right. So Ellie argues we see the same patterns in how intellectuals approach the Cold War, Vietnam, even the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
So there's this recurring theme of intellectuals pushing for policies based on their own ideology without really thinking about the consequences.
And that can put pressure on policymakers to make decisions that fit the popular intellectual mood, even if those decisions aren't the best for everyone.
It's a lot to think about. It shows how important it is to think critically and be willing to challenge the conventional wisdom, even when it's coming from people who are seen as, like, the experts.
Hmm.
It makes you wonder if maybe there's just this, like, inherent naivete at play. Both Sowell and Wolin seem to be saying that intellectuals, even with all their smarts and good intentions, can be out of touch with how complicated the real world is.
Yeah, it's like they're operating in this world of pure ideas detached from the nitty-gritty where things have, like, real consequences.
And that detachment, as we've seen, it can lead to some pretty bad outcomes.
For sure.
It shows how important it is to bridge that gap between ideas and action,
Right.
to understand that theory and practice don't always line up so neatly.
Absolutely.
So where does that leave us? How do we apply all this to our own lives? How do we become, like, smarter consumers of information?
Ooh, the million-dollar question.
Especially in a world where everyone's got an opinion and we're constantly being bombarded with information from all sides.
It's overwhelming, right?
It is.
We can't just passively accept every idea we hear, even if it comes from someone we respect or it kind of fits with what we already believe.
It's so easy to just go along with what everyone else is saying, especially if it sounds, smart and sophisticated.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We got to be willing to ask those tough questions, to consider different viewpoints.
To think for ourselves.
Exactly. And to judge ideas based on their actual impact, not just on how clever they sound or how well they fit into our worldview.
That's easier said than done, though, right? I mean, look at the media landscape today.
It's a mess.
It's a mess. We're drowning in opinions, hot takes, instant analysis. It's hard to even know what's true anymore.
It's tough to sift through it all.
And that's where these insights from Sowell and Wolin are so helpful. They're not just criticizing, they're giving us a way to think critically about the ideas we encounter.
Yeah. They're helping us understand the motivations and biases of the people presenting those ideas.
Right.
And they're basically warning us about the dangers of just blindly following intellectuals.
It's like they're giving us this toolkit for navigating this crazy world of information.
A survival guide, almost.
Right. It's about developing a healthy skepticism, but without becoming cynical or rejecting expertise altogether.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Respecting knowledge, but also thinking for ourselves.
Exactly. And being open to the possibility that we might be wrong about something.
That our beliefs need to change.
That's the beauty of intellectual humility, right? It keeps us learning and growing, and it lets us have real conversations with people who see things differently.
Even when it's hard.
Even when it's uncomfortable. Because at the end of the day, it's not about winning arguments or proving that we're right.
It's about something bigger.
It's about searching for truth and using what we know to make the world a better place.
And that's something we can all get behind, I think.
Definitely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into intellectuals and society, I'm left with one final question. If intellectuals are as prone to these pitfalls as Sowell and Wolin suggest, should we just ignore everything they say?
I mean, it's tempting, right?
It is.
Just tune it all out. Reject anything that smells like the ivory tower.
But I think there's a better way.
Oh, for sure.
One that recognizes the dangers of intellectual influence, but also sees the value that intellectuals can bring.
Right. Instead of dismissing them completely, maybe we can learn from their mistakes, from the stories that Sowell and Wolin tell us.
Yeah, use those lessons.
To become more critical and careful about the information we take in. To be active participants in the world of ideas, not just passive consumers.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, we can use what we've learned to build a better world.
A more informed world, a more thoughtful world.
It's a goal worth fighting for. And I think this deep dive has given us some powerful tools to help us get there.
I think so too.
Thanks for joining us on this intellectual adventure.
Until next time.